Welcome to the Climate Tech Product Show. And today I'm talking with Katie Oliver, who is a sensational expert in customer development and defining customer segments. I've worked with Katie in the past, and one of the things that I love about her approach is that she's got a bit of a nose for what a good customer looks like, or how to define your customer properly. She's done marketing strategies and customer development to death. But don't hear it from me. Katie, tell us a little bit about your experience and why we should trust anything that you say.
Yeah, for sure. I've been in, I guess, broadly speaking, the marketing space for probably 15 years now. I started in corporates and have really kind of done everything from digital to PR to more recently innovation, product development, customer experience design. So really the whole kind of, I guess, gambit when it comes to marketing, sales, product. I started in corporate, and then probably 5 or 6 years ago now, sort of left that world to try to do more meaningful and impactful work. And at the same time started getting very concerned about climate change and how the world is going about dealing with that problem. So I started studying a master's in sustainability as well. So awesome. For the last kind of 4 to 5 years, I've really been trying to bring together that kind of customer strategy, marketing, sort of innovation knowledge with impactful work, the climate tech space, and solving some of the challenges we have in that space. So I've worked with very big corporates, brands that you'd know in Australia and globally, as well as in the public sector, government sector, and also again, more recently in the last kind of 5 years, some really exciting startups in Australia.
Great. So for anyone who's listened to a previous episode from the podcast, what we've been doing is speaking to people across all of the different boxes on the lean canvas. So there are a whole bunch of different boxes, but you are supposed to start with the customer segment and the early adopter. And that's one of the things that I find a lot of people fail to define properly. Or they haven't defined at all. So a lot of people start thinking about these things with a solution in mind, and they haven't really spent a hell of a lot of time to flesh out who their customer is. So can you just explain to us a little bit, Katie, what is the problem with doing that? What's the problem with not starting with your customer and actually starting with a solution?
Yeah, and I see this a lot, as you do. A lot of really brilliant, clever people see an opportunity or a gap to build something, but haven't thought about the problem that it solves or the customer that it's right for. And the issue with that is you spend a lot of the first, time period of your business trying to fit that product with a market. So, from an innovation point of view or a human-centered design point of view, you always start with the customer. So what do we know about the customer? What's their problem? How can we build something to solve that? When you start the other way around, you need to kind of go back and figure out how to make the product that you have built or the solution that you've built fit with the customer. And that can take, time, money, energy, experimentation to do that. It's not impossible. And that's a lot of what we do, because a lot of innovation tends to come out of those, seeing those gaps or seeing those opportunities. And people who work really deeply in a space and know it so well, they can identify those things, but often they don't necessarily understand that kind of human-centered or customer-centric view on the world.
And, I find a lot of people, or at least in corporates, a lot of people define these as sort of personas. Mm-hmm. And I've been sort of pushed back a few times on that's just some bullshit that corporates use to put into a PowerPoint slide so that we can put a name and a cute quote onto the customer segment that we're targeting. So are they rubbish? Is it worthwhile defining a persona? What do we get out of defining a persona? Because if it's just a bunch of assumptions, what's the value in it, in your view?
Yeah, great question. So from a corporate point of view, I would say often, yes, they are pointless, and they are that cute little slide that fills out a deck and has a nice little quote on it. But for, a startup, I think they're actually really, really valuable. And if you use them in the right way, they're really, really valuable. So the reason that they're valuable is because and I'm talking about a persona that goes beyond, men between 30 and 50 who like cars. You've really got to, if you go deeper than that, it's about understanding mindsets and behaviors, and therefore getting insights around where your customer might be, the type of things they like, the type of things they do. And from understanding those things, you can then figure out how you get your product in front of them. So I think they're really valuable for businesses who are trying to get their first sales, for example, or scale beyond an initial kind of set of customers, because it helps you narrow down the types of people that you're looking for, which can save you time, money, all of those important things.
So you're saying almost like incorporate an insight into the persona. So that insight around the channel, for example, where your customer might be, you kind of, they are a Facebook user, therefore you are targeting them via Facebook, for example.
Yeah, totally. So the way I think about personas, and there's kind of, I guess, a few different categories that I brainstorm kind of with startups in this space. So demographics, yes, like they are important. Age, type of role in a company, for example. Do they have a family? Where do they live, or where are they located? What do they do? Those types of things are important. But other things to think about are, what's important to them? What are their values? How do they think about life? What are their goals for the next kind of 5 years or 10 years? What are they trying to achieve? What are they struggling with? What are their pain points? What really, bothers them? What motivates them in life? So what gets them out of bed in the morning? What are their hopes and dreams? What sort of questions might they have about the space that you're in or the product that you have? Who and what influences them, and not necessarily influencers, but who around them do they care about? Do they listen to that they think is important? How do they consume information, which is what you just alluded to? So where do they go for information in general, but also about the type of product that you might sell? Are they a Facebook user? Are they an Instagram user? Are they a tech tinkerer who's deep in Reddit forums somewhere? And then the last thing that I like to think about is, what are the use cases for your product for that customer? Because it might be different depending on the different types of customer. So I would look at all of those things, and it doesn't have to be defined as one person that, this is John and he embodies all of these things. It can be slightly more broad than that. And there might be some things in a persona that don't necessarily sit together super well, but it's about kind of starting with what you know. So, entrepreneurs, people who start these businesses, founders, etc., they know a lot about what they do. They know a lot about the space. So it's kind of like, let's take a first stab at who we think this customer is, or there might be multiple, and that will come out through that process. And then let's test some of those assumptions. Yeah. So we don't know everything, we know a lot, but let's kind of take a stab and then go from there and refine and build.
It struck me as you were sort of going through all those different things that I think are worth considering when developing a customer segment or a persona. It struck me that 99% of those things to begin with are an assumption, or are the only way to determine them is through speaking with customers and knowing your customer and getting in front of your customer. And I don't know, have you found that a lot of people are hesitant to get in front of customers, or haven't gotten in front of customers and don't really know who those people are?
Yeah, totally. I was talking to someone this week actually, and the first thing I kind of said was, they said, "Oh, we've got some customers on board. We've got revenue coming in, etc." I was like, "Okay, so what do you know about the customers? Like, who are they? What have you already learned?" Because by having customers already on the books, the best place to start is who has already got skin in the game, who's put money into this, who's bought this product, and what do they look like? So that's a good place to kind of start if you've really got no idea. And then the other thing is, yes, spot on. Talking to people is really important. Definitely founders, people in the startup world are nervous about that. But I spent like a few months last year, we interviewed like 150 different people. And so I managed to get over even my nervousness around just picking up the phone to people. But the best thing to do is to ask. And I found that people are often really willing to help. Like, I think we're always scared that they're going to say, no, I don't, like, go away, or judge you or whatever. But I think for the most part, if you're asking for someone's help and advice, they're more than willing to have a quick chat with you about it. And I always say, like, start with your existing customers. So someone who's already a customer of yours, if you have them, pick the phone up. Building a relationship with your existing customers is the best way to understand them. And they always have amazing insights too. So one of the questions I often will ask, existing customers is, who else do you think this solution is for? because they'll come up with like random, you know, not all the time, but often kind of a random, like, I think it'd be really good in this scenario. And you're like, wow, like I never thought about that, but that's maybe a potential segment for us. So having that close relationship with customers, especially in the early days, I think is, critical.
That's awesome. And look, maybe this is stating the obvious, but just for our listeners, if you fail to understand your customer, you will fail to understand their problems, meaning that you will fail to understand whether your solution can actually solve them, right? So the whole thing kind of ladders up from the customer. Okay, now another thing that I'm sure you've come across as well is this idea that when they define their customer segment, they've done it way too broadly. And they're usually, I find, doing that because they want to keep this huge addressable market because they have world domination aspirations. But probably the most used phrase from marketing over the last few years is, if you target everyone, you target no one. Yep. So can you walk us through how do you actually work back or work down from something, a huge customer segment or a huge addressable market, work down to a persona or an early adopter that is meaningful, and how perhaps help people alleviate that fear of niching and targeting too much, because I find that they get really nervous about this idea that, oh, but there's only 5 of these people.
Yeah, totally. And it is a balance, right? Like you don't want to get to that point where, I don't know, you're doing some Facebook ads and there's only 100 people in the pool. Like that's, probably not going to be sufficient. So it is a bit of a balance. I'd say the first thing is kind of what are your goals? So what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to, increase sales? Are you trying to understand your customer? Like what's the goal? I would say I'm not afraid of being nichey, and you'd probably agree with this, because most products, and probably specifically in the climate space, given where we are right now, are not for everyone. And so there's no point, and it costs you a lot of money to go broad when you could be more targeted and spending better money, I guess, or hopefully getting a better outcome. The other benefit, I guess, of going niche is you can rule groups out. So when you're going really broad, it's hard to get a bit of a view of who really are the types of people who are purchasing, our product, our solution, for example. If you go more niche to start with, you'll get some pretty clear results, I think, pretty quickly. So say you go after a particular type of customer and you get nothing from that, and you tinker with copy, imagery, landing pages, etc., and you're just not getting anywhere. You could probably make an assumption that well, it's not even an assumption at that point. You probably get some evidence to say that that's not the type of customer that wants what you're selling. And so you can more quickly rule things out, which can also be beneficial when you do go more niche. Now, I would also say, as you said, you can't be everything to everyone. And so you are better off picking, I'd almost say, depending on the stage of the business, starting with 1, like not even going for 3, but say 3 max. Like we think if there's enough difference between them, 3 max, let's test those. And
3 niches, 3 segments?
3 segments.
Yeah. And we're talking about like black and white, not sort of shades of gray.
Yeah, I would say so. They'd have to be significant. And some of the things like mindset, for example, might be the same, because you'll be looking for a person in a particular stage of life, or looking for a particular thing. But yes, black and white enough, I guess, that if you're going to do some digital marketing, for example, you're not getting crossover with those groups of segments. Or those groups of people. So yeah, maximum I'd say of kind of 3 to get started. And then the benefit of that is you test and refine as you go. And you might find that maybe 2 start to come together, or 2 start to go apart, or you only need 1, or there's actually 4, for example. So it's not, I was talking to someone this week actually about, having a plan for discovery and then a plan for scale. And I was like, it can't be that clear cut. What you should be doing is continuously improving from your discovery phase into scale. So it's not like, okay, draw a line in the sand. We've done the discovery. We now know, off we go. It's kind of like, how do we keep learning and how do we keep refining and getting better? And then as we start to scale, how do we then broaden that out and bring other customers into the mix?
Amazing. You've made me think about 2 things that I've worked on you in the past with. Is this, you're developing a persona, and sometimes they end up looking like rubbish. They're not believable. They're not realistic. And it's this kind of contrived illusion of a human that we came up with just to kind of shove our product down their throat. So how can you tell? I mean, I know you have a skill for this, but is there some sort of rule of thumb to say, hey, look, I've defined this persona that's unrealistic, or that person doesn't exist, or I've just done it really badly? Like, maybe let's just start there. What does a poorly defined persona look like?
Yeah. The best ones, or the best worst ones that I've seen are things like, I'll say, you know, who's your customer? And they're like, doctors. That's very, very broad. Or it's like doctors in their 40s, for example. For me, that's bad. That's way too broad. There's no insight even into, like, you know, slightly more demographic info there. There's no information about what's important to them, mindset, you know, values. So that's kind of, I guess, what I would say bad, but
and the thinking, I've heard something along this line that is, you know, two doctors in their 40s, they share the same exact demographics, they live in the same exact suburb, make the same exact income, but one has this behavior that is sort of diametrically opposed to the other one, right? So how do you tell them apart? If you're standing in a room full of doctors in their 40s, how do you know which one is the one that you're targeting?
Yeah, spot on, exactly. So you've got to think about what are and coming at a persona, you're coming at it obviously from your product point of view. So what are the types of things that you think a doctor in their 40s would be thinking or feeling if they're going to purchase or look at your product or service? And so that's why I kind of give those categories around, these are the types of things to think about. And it doesn't have to be, you know, super, super detailed, but there needs to be some level of insight in that can allow you to then seek that person out. So for example, when you go doctors in their 40s, that's so broad. How would you go about finding a doctor in their 40s online? There's no way to make any deductions isn't the right word, but there's no way to kind of connect to a way that person seeks out information, for example. If you think about a doctor in their 40s who, you know, lives in the inner city, who is really, really tech savvy and, you know, has a practice, but has all this great tech. And so they're really in touch with, you know, the latest technology. You could then make an assumption that person probably goes to conferences, for example, in their industry that are talking about the latest tech. And so then that gives you a connection point potentially to that type of a person. And so the persona is all about understanding enough about the customer that you can make some decisions about how to put your solution or product in front of them. Because if you don't do that, there are hundreds of channels, hundreds of messages, hundreds of images that you could potentially use. How on earth do you narrow down the right combination to target that person? And that's what the persona is about.
Awesome. That is probably the best definition of persona I've ever heard. That give you enough information to make decisions about how to target them. That's really good. That's pretty powerful. And it's awesome because it ties into my next bunch of questions. So look, if I had $1 for every time I've heard someone say, oh, we're going to make our sales through word of mouth and Facebook ads or a content marketing strategy, I would be a very rich man. So we've developed a persona. It's obviously a fantastic one with all the tips that you've given us. And now we've
done a dummy one. Maybe we can do that after.
That's given us enough information to say, hey, look, we're going to target them through this conference of high-tech doctors' equipment, or we're going to do Facebook ads, whatever the case may be. But we now have a point of view around channel. How do we flesh that out further? So channels is one of the boxes in the canvas. It's how our path to customer. It's what we're going to use to make them aware, to make them consider, and hopefully even make their decision to purchase the good, the product, the service from us. So how do you then now start translating persona into kind of channel strategy or marketing strategy, I guess?
Yeah, good question. And it is a tricky question. And it's, I guess, something that's, like you said, kind of become a skill of mine because I've done it for such a long time. It's follow the bouncing ball to an extent. Like it's sort of logic. So once you come up with a persona and you sort of put yourself into into, you know, the shoes of that person, you can kind of make measured guesses, I guess, about what the right channel for that person might be. Now, also, I would say a persona isn't always something that you come up with. If you've got existing customers, you can use data and insights that, you know, tell you more about that person and therefore where they would be. You can also ask your customers, right? So that you're coming up with a persona based on what you know about your customers and from your customers. But you'll see, as you go through that process, you'll start to see things emerge. So when you put yourself in the shoes of that person and you've built this persona, naturally things kind of come to you and come out. And when you're in the space, in your product space, for example, I don't know, you make medical technology or whatever, you do know the space. And so you can start to see connections, put things together about which channels might be right. Now, I always say, go where your customer is. I think, like you said, there's a lot of like, oh, we'll just like do Facebook ads. And, you know, that's how we'll get our customers. Yes, Facebook ads work for some products and some services, but certainly not, well, probably not the majority really. And certainly in climate tech, I mean, you and I have seen it can be challenging depending on the product and the type of customer to use Facebook ads for certain solutions. And so you've got to figure out where your customer is and go there. And in the early days, like often it's like pick up a phone or it's manual things. It's not as easy as, you know, we'll get scale quickly and straight away. It's pick up a phone, it's send an email, it's chase them down on LinkedIn. But you can start to automate those things as you get more traction and more understanding of who your customer is and where they are.
And you mean automate as in like put it through a platform like Facebook ads as opposed to just picking up the phone?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. I mean, I was chatting to someone this week about, you know, in their first kind of funnel, I guess, is literally going to be look up the people on LinkedIn, try and find a phone number and email address, get on the phone to them, ask them about their business, and then send them a link so they can register, for example, for this product. Yeah. And so what you can do is, if that's your starting point, rather than going, okay, we stop that, we move on to the next thing, we look at each stage of that process and figure out, you know, how do we find a way to automate and get scale in each of those things? So there's only so many times you can pick up the phone every day, but is there a way to automate sending that person an email? Could we send them an email with a video attached to it? Could we, you know, is it Facebook ads? Is it LinkedIn message? You know, what are the different options that can help you get to more people more quickly as you start to prove out that funnel is right for that customer?
You brought up a pretty interesting point, and something I've encountered is that people tend to go for the most high volume thing straight off the bat. Because, you know, we believe in the power, for example, of Facebook ads. And so everyone sort of immediately kind of thinks that is sort of a channel. And there's, particularly with your example of picking up the phone, there is so much to be gained from having that conversation that you can then go and incorporate into your definition of your customer segment, what have you. But I find that people tend to shy away from the manual, potentially intimidating things. And it's this kind of combination of, I have world domination ambitions, so why would I waste my time making these kind of phone calls? That doesn't scale. I'm not going to make millions making phone calls. Yep. But if you haven't made the phone calls, then I personally don't think you have a hope in hell of making the Facebook ad succeed, because you're kind of missing the mark, particularly in the beginning when you're just starting off, right? Yeah. So any kind of tips or words around that is like, you know, perhaps do it in stages. You're starting off with something clunky and manual and then sort of grow from there. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of just probably have to accept that at the beginning it might be a little bit clunky and manual, but as you say, the payoff for that is significant. So, I mean, look, you can go about it in both ways, right? And you will learn both ways. But my personal view and experience is that we have inbuilt bias, you know, especially if we've built a product or we know the space really well. You have assumptions about things that you don't really even know that you have assumptions about. And often you miss things if you don't speak to your customers or have a close relationship with your customers. And so I think if you start the business off without having that view that, you know, we're open to what input from our customers, then it's a dangerous slope. and you know, customers don't know everything, right? Like a person didn't sit in a focus group and say, I want a little handheld device where I can Google things, and you know, the iPhone was born. There's a combination, right? But I think there's nothing to be lost, and there's only things to be gained by understanding and being close to your customers and having that mindset in your business that you always, you know, a customer is also a stakeholder in your business. And so you should always at least have some level of input from customers as you build and continue to develop your product and add features and things like that. I just think it's dangerous not to have a customer at the table somehow as you start to build. So for me, sales, product, marketing, all of it is about meeting a customer need, whether that's a pain point or a, you know, their hopes and dreams, or, you know, I think if you don't think about your business that way, that's a potentially lethal place to be, because the only people who are going to buy your product are your customers, whether it's B2C or B2B. Yeah. If they're not part of that conversation, it can be dangerous.
Yeah. Okay. Another question on this topic is, would you change your tactic significantly or approach this whole thing differently when we're talking about business to consumer or a business to business channel?
Yeah, approach, no, but certainly channels and what you end up doing, yes. So again, I would say you've got to go where your customer is. And so, you know, it might be that you're, I don't know, maybe you're targeting social media managers, for example, and they are your customer segment, then sure, maybe something like social platforms would work for them. But if you're looking at, you know, targeting key decision makers in big corporates like CEOs or COOs, for example, are you going to be doing Facebook ads to get to them? Well, logic for me, and this is a process that you would work through, says, you know, your average CEO probably isn't spending a huge amount of time on Facebook looking for solutions for their business. And so you've got to think through, and this is why personas are so valuable. Who is the person that you're going after? And personas work equally well in B2B space. Who is the person? Who is the decision maker? How do we get in front of them? And in B2B space, it tends to be a little more kind of manual, right? It's a longer pipeline, it's relationship building, depending on the product and the solution, obviously. But it can be harder to get scale, I guess, in that space. Often you need a, you know, sales development or people, boots on the ground.
Amazing. Katie, you've walked us through so many cool things and shared so many insights. I'm just going to recap a couple of things as we've been furiously typing away. So when we were talking about defining your persona, you mentioned this idea of incorporating insights into the persona and not just stopping at demographics, but, you know, what is important to them, goals, values, motivations, what are the use cases that you have for your product, and how do you incorporate that into the persona? I really like that question that you said you ask when you're having a conversation with a customer about who else is the solution for, because sometimes they might think of things that you haven't. Really good point about using data from your existing customers. So if you already have a handful, just work back from them to define your persona. Then on the topic of being too targeted, being too niche, really, really, really good point that most climate techs are not for everyone. I'm about to do a webinar or a podcast or something where just to unpack that problem specifically, because I keep having the same conversation with completely different founders. Yeah. And if you look at the way that sort of an idea or a solution propagates through the market, you always have these kind of innovators, early adopters before that sort of moves on to the mass market. I'd say 99% of the businesses that I've spoken to are their product is only relevant to that very early innovator, early adopter, still is, because unfortunately for the world, a lot of this stuff is still very much on the fringes, still very much for the diehards. So there's no point in wasting your time, effort, and money targeting the masses just yet. But you need to at least, anyhow, that's a completely different topic. But I really like that point about climate techs aren't for everyone. So stop being deluded that you're going to get this out to the masses tomorrow morning.
Totally. Unless you want to invest heavily in education, right? Because that's the piece that's that bridge that needs to be, or the gap that needs to be bridged. And startups in this space don't have, the money and the time to be.
Yeah.
Yet.
Yeah. And it's a risky exercise, right?
Yep.
So then I also really like this point that you made about ruling groups out. So you define a whole bunch of different niches. You might realize that some of them are perhaps unattractive to you as a business. Some of them are too small, but you start to realize, hey, I don't really care to serve this segment. So defining the segments that you don't want to target is pretty valuable as well. When it gets to now boots on the ground, we're defining these different segments. Don't define hundreds and hundreds of them, but just pick 3 segments max and make sure that they are distinct and different enough, not just different shades of gray, so that you get clear signals when you move on to your testing.
Yes. Hold on.
Your definition of a persona, I'm going to use that forever, is to give you enough information to make a decision about how to target them. Yep. It's not just about the warm and fuzzy presentation.
Yeah, that's right.
Then moving on to, I guess, your channel strategy is I think your overarching message there was to go where your customer is, whether it's B2B, B2C, you using that information from the persona to make those measured guesses of where you should be targeting. Develop your funnel, start small, don't be afraid of it being clunky. You can always sort of scale that down the road, but you should always continue to get input from your customer, because it's dangerous to kind of omit that step. And it's dangerous, I guess, to do these things in a vacuum and in isolation of your customer. That's the whole reason human-centered design was invented, because so many companies realized that they had gotten miles apart from the customer, had no idea, and they were just building these things that nobody wanted.
Yeah, and we've experienced that, right? Like sometimes, people in the corporate think they have this brilliant idea and they get so much momentum and so much money gets invested, and then you go to sell it and it's like, oh my God, this actually doesn't solve a problem. It doesn't meet a customer need. No one wants this thing that we spent all this money building. And so it's, you can avoid that. It can be avoided. And unfortunately, sometimes it means you will fail, but at least you failed early and fast and you can pivot, rather than failing after spending $40 million trying to build a product, that doesn't work.
The old build it and they will come, hey?
That's right.
Look, the whole fail fast thing, I think people like the sound of it, but it hurts the ego. It hurts. It's so hard to overcome so many of those biases that we have when we come up with an idea and we think it's the best thing since sliced bread. But if you put your let's solve the climate crisis hat on, wouldn't it be great to find out that this idea that you have in front of you sucks, so that you can quickly move on to the next idea that is aligned to helping and solving the climate crisis, and you can use that passion and that energy that you've got left into your next idea, instead of pushing shit uphill with an idea that just isn't going to work. So the sooner we realize that these things suck, the sooner we can move on to helping on other things that hopefully don't suck.
Totally.
Katie Oliver, you are a legend. Thank you so much for joining me on the Climate Tech Product Show today. I hope our listeners got a lot out of defining their customer persona and their channel strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Stop recording.